Well, this is a little unusual for us to be getting all together. It's not something that we've been doing. I hope that it'll go well. And tonight's topic is one that I think particularly men and women often hear preached to them individually as groups as opposed to all together. So we'll take a look at this tonight. Jimmy and Maria are away. We do, wish them well and hope that Jimmy's cold is better and that their time with Maria's family is just a, very powerful time. Maria's mother's getting older, and this was a time for the family to all get together, I think to gather around and encourage her and all be together. And so we're gathering all together as a family tonight as well. And that's, that's particularly good because this section of scripture we're going to look at, I've entitled tonight's class, The Household Code. And this is our fifth SEC class in Colossians, and we'll go ahead and get started. So, we start off, and Colossians starts with this magnificent description of Jesus, how he is, beyond, anything, that could have been made in this world. As a matter of fact, he made the world, and that we are to set our minds and our hearts on him. And then we have this transition passage, which leads into tonight's scriptures. And in it, starting in Colossians 3, verse 12 to 17, in view of this, in view of how majestic Jesus is, how he died for us, how we can put on, Christ in baptism, that we can set our hearts and minds on the things that are above. It says, then therefore, there's some things that we need to do. It says, therefore, we need to bear with each other. Therefore, we need to forgive each other. Therefore, we need to put on love. Therefore, we need to have the peace of Christ. And we do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus. And so these are some, awesome verses for us. These really are principles about our relationships. And they're things for us to then go on, and we go on in the passage into what we'll look at tonight and try to make these more practical. What does it mean? How do we bear with each other, forgive each other, kind of, and so forth? As we read this passage, it assumes that we're all disciples of Jesus, that we will see that in each of the relationships that are addressed, that the people are told to behave in a way that illustrates the relationship of Jesus and his church. We're to be a living picture to the world of Jesus, loving and saving the church, and of the church humbly following Jesus. For many, the only sermon they'll ever hear is how you act out the living picture of this relationship between Christ and his church. As we read in the parallel passages, and we know that Colossians and Ephesians, remember they were both written about the same time by Paul, when he was in prison, probably in Rome, and they were carried by Tychicus back into Asia Minor, into this region. And in Ephesians 5, after discussing these passages that we'll look at tonight, Paul wrote, "This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church." And so everything that we do tonight really is, think of it as it's a way in our relationships, in our households, of drawing that picture, of painting that living picture of Jesus and his church. So let's go ahead and read the verses together. It's not too long of a passage. In Colossians 3, starting in verse 18, it says, "Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work out with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It's the Lord Christ you're serving. If anyone does wrong, he'll be repaid for their wrongs, for there is no favoritism." In chapter 4, verse 1, "Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven." Now, the set of specific instructions contained in this section are often referred to as the Haustafel, which literally means the house table, or we can call it the household codes. This type of instruction for domestic relationship behavior was common in the ancient world. We find these in ancient Greek, Roman, as well as Jewish and Christian writings. But as you might guess, in the Christian writings, we look and see, well, what's different about it? How is Jesus calling us to live differently from the world around? And in our case, specifically, Rome was when these scriptures first went out. What Paul was saying, draw a distinction between the way you live in your households and the way that your neighbors around you live. So the first century Roman expectations, are found in numerous places, and we can kind of pull together what many of those are. We see that Roman law vested enormous power in the patria potestas, the rule of the fathers, where the husband was over his family, which included his wife, his children, his descendants, his slaves, and freemen. Originally, this power was absolute and included the power of life and death. He could acknowledge, banish, kill, or disown a child. The paterfamilias had the power to sell his children into slavery. And even the law required that they ensure that obviously deformed infants were put to death. I hope you're already seeing some distinctions between what Jesus would want for us. The patres familias wielded complete and separate authority over members of their household, including their enslaved laborers. While some Roman patres familias permitted enslaved individuals in their households to establish quasi-marital unions as a means of forming bonds within the enslaved communities, these unions were only recognized within the household and carried no legal bearing outside of the household. The children that resulted from these unions were themselves enslaved and considered the legal property of their mother's owner. Roman legal sources often recognized enslaved people as part of the instruments or equipment of the household to highlight the service they provided to the families. This included both the people working in the fields and those in the domestic household and those working in the businesses. So this idea of having household codes written down was a very common thing. And so it's really only sensible that we would see that, that Paul would write that God through him would have written down what a Christian household should look like to differentiate that. We found these household codes in the first century church here in Colossians chapter 3, in Ephesians chapter 5, but also in 1 Peter chapter 3. So it's interesting to look at those. We'll do our comparison mostly with the Ephesians passage tonight as we walk through and see what God calls us to in our domestic relationships. So point number 1, wives, show us the church. This first verse that we read here in Colossians 3:18, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting to the Lord, is specifically addressed to wives, to those in a marriage relationship. Now, we're going to look at these different categories of people that have instructions addressed to them. And even if it doesn't fit exactly my situation, there are still things that I can learn from it. And I hope that all of us tonight, regardless of which verses we're looking at, will say, how does this apply to me? What is the principle at work here that even if my situation is slightly different, I can still apply? But here it's addressed to wives. And often as I've used this verse and read it and especially used it in helping couples in counseling, I'd wish that the husbands did not receive this or ever see this verse. Wives are the ones that are told to put themselves in submission. This is not addressed to husbands to force their wives to submit to them. Well, let's look at the parallel passage here in Ephesians and continue reading in it. Ephesians 5:21 starts with submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Then it goes on, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. This can be troubling in today's society because today's society wants to define submitting in a very demeaning way. Things like being a slave to your husband, submitting to his every wish, having no say of your own. But submission is defined as the action or fact of accepting or yielding to a superior force or to the will or authority of another person. There's a voluntary aspect to submitting. Submitting means putting others before yourself. It means not always doing what you want to do. It means putting God's desires above your desires. But also we should note it's not subjugation. It's interesting that when we get to the household instructions for children and for servants, we'll see that they're told to obey. But the wives are not told to obey. They're instructed to submit to their husbands. While obedience is following orders or commands, submission is yielding to power or authority. When looking at the definitions, they look so much alike, but the difference between the two stem from the sentiment of the individual who follows the wishes of another. When a person follows a rule, it's not because the individual wills it, but it's because the individual has little choice to do otherwise. Let's assume you're a worker who's been ordered to work for some extra hours during the busy season. The person would complete the work and obey the orders of his or her superior. However, this act of obeying is not the genuine desire of the individual, but it's the result of a situation where if the worker doesn't comply, they'll risk losing their position. Submission is when a person gives in to the authority or greater power. However, unlike obedience, it is willful and out of respect for the person in power. Earlier, in obedience, there was no sentiment involved, and the person merely followed orders. But in this case, the individual follows orders because he respects and is willing to comply with the instructions. Especially when we speak of God, we often talk about obeying God, but truly we need to submit to God, to make that voluntary obedience to follow what he wants, where we submit it and subjugate our will to his. This is because there's love and respect for the greater power and authority. As an individual submits to authority or power, there exists a particular bond between the one who submits and the one in power. So this brings to focus the concept that submission comes from within, unlike obedience. A wife who submits to her husband will choose to go along with his leadership on an issue, even if she doesn't agree that it's the best way. She does so out of love and respect for her husband and ultimately for God. It is one way of acknowledging God's ultimate headship. The honor comes from trusting that God is in control and will take care of her. This shows the world the same attitude that Jesus had when he trusted the Father in going to the cross. Right, in Matthew 26, we read that going a little farther, Jesus, fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." And a little later, it says a second time, he also prayed, "My Father, if it's not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." Jesus did not want to go to the cross, but made the hardest decision to honor the Father and submit to his will. Excuse me. Submission, though, is not just for husbands and wives, although it absolutely is for them. We're all called to submit to God, to the elders, to the governing authorities, as well as to each other. So that is a lot of people. That's a pretty broad swath that you need to submit to, that I need to submit to. We all do, and especially summed up in Ephesians 5:21, submitting to one another. You know, I've had to submit to the elders several times over my Christian life on issues that I didn't agree with. One time had to do with the application of the rules for attending preteen and teen camps. I didn't agree with the direction that the elders chose, but out of respect for God and the position that he had given them, I went along with it. And if not exactly joyful about it, put it behind without too much grumbling and complaining. I wish I could say with no grumbling and complaining, but without too much, in bringing, my will in submission to that will out of love and respect. If we find passages that direct our submission in many areas, why do you think that Paul is calling out in this passage that wives need to submit to their husbands? I think there's something there about the way that men and women are wired, which leads to it. We find one terrific passage where we see the delightful outcome of a wife in submission. In 1 Peter 3, we read, "Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives." What great examples we have in the church of wives saving their husbands by these acts of submission. Just a week and a half ago in our Sunday service, Kevin Braxton shared how his wife Renee had become a disciple. I think it was 4 years before he did. And she carried on and changed the way that she behaved in a way that really attracted him and pulled his heart and was really instrumental in his becoming a disciple. I think of Susan and Christopher Tregonis that many of you know. We knew Susan very early when she was converted, like 30 years ago. And as a very young mom, she chose to follow Jesus and try to live out the scriptures as best she could. And that was a big part of winning over her husband, Chris, who became a disciple, served for many years and just passed away in this past year. But when I see, women like Renee and women like Susan and see how they've, won over their husbands, we see the scripture put into practice, and that's just marvelous. Not just unbelieving husbands, but even disciples who would have wandered away without their wives' example of purity and reverence. Again, this verse is not a guarantee that husbands will be converted in this way. God gives each person his own free will to choose their life's direction, but we need to continue to pray for and support our sisters and brothers who have spouses who have not yet come to faith. A wife's godly submission and a husband's godly leadership have also been great examples to the world, and many have been drawn to check out Jesus by the Christian marriages that we've seen. We'll look a little more at men and women differences in a minute, but let's first look at the instruction that's specific then to husbands. So point number 2, husbands, show us Jesus. Now, there's no better role model in all of the universe to follow than Jesus. But there's no more challenging example to live up to than Jesus. Here we read that husbands are to love your wives and do not be harsh with them, as we read in the Colossians passage. In the parallel passage in Ephesians 5, it says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but they feed it and care for it, just as Christ does the church. For we're all members of this body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. We see here the principle that husbands are to treat their wives in the same way Jesus treats the church. And that's called out looking at these together in a number of ways. Without harshness, by giving himself up, with the care and consideration someone gives their own body, loving his wife as he loves himself. Husbands, how would your wife or others who see your marriage close up say you're doing in imitating Christ in these ways? Do you hold yourself to these high standards? Do you have lapses when you drop your guard and give in to selfishness and treat your wife in harsh, unloving ways? Even if that doesn't happen often, it can be very destructive. Is there an atmosphere where people feel they need to walk on eggshells around you? Does your family pull back? You don't have to be bitten too many times by an otherwise docile dog before you stop reaching out with your hand to give it a pet. Even if you don't often react with harshness, if you do at all, you can be creating an atmosphere of PTSD in your household. And I'm sure that's something that none of us would want. If you don't know whether your household has that or not, talk to your spouse, talk to your kids, talk to the others who are close and can see. But the instructions in these passages that are addressed to husbands are all about how to treat your wife with gentleness like Jesus. It's not about what to tell her to do, what her instructions are. It's about the manner that you should have in the way that you treat her. Notice that it does not say that husbands should force their wives to submit to them, as I mentioned before. It's the wife's duty to voluntarily submit, but it's not the husband's duty to try to force it. Too many husbands have hurt their wife's faith by playing the I am the master card. This is unbiblical. What Paul is painting here is God's plan for harmony in the marriage, where the husband treats his wife so well that she wants to follow his lead, and she has such a godly way about her that he's drawn to only lead her with the utmost respect and gentleness. In preparing this lesson, I asked my wife, Marilyn, if I've ever played the I am the master card in our 30 plus years of marriage. She couldn't think of a time, but she did say the hardest time for her to happily submit came 3 years ago when I changed jobs. I had been the head of research and development for a large private company, but had been quite unhappy with the way that upper management was treated. I left and took my current job as a college professor at a small private university in central Vermont. Marilyn was concerned with not only my significant drop in salary, but also with the excessive commuting time, which of course would be time away from home, but then just wear and tear on me on the roads and stuff as well. That first year I was driving 5.5 hours a day until we bought a condo up there where I stay over sometimes now. What stood out to me when she was saying how hard it was for her to embrace this career and lifestyle change is that I had never realized, the level of how hard it was. I knew she had reservations about my making the change, but she never tried to fight me on it or change my mind. She said I was the one who had to go to work every day, and that I had always taken care of our family. So she accepted my desire, even realizing that it might make things harder on her. I love having a godly wife. These challenging instructions are not just for husbands, but apply to how we treat each other. Just the call to submission is not just a call for wives, but for all disciples of Jesus. Singles should also take these principles to heart as we all seek to grow to be more like Christ. If we all should submit to each other, and none of us should be harsh, why does Paul specifically address the call to submission to wives and the prohibition against harshness to husbands? Some wives need to focus on not being harsh, and some men need to focus on having an attitude of godly submission. But maybe there are some inherent tendencies that are more common to one than the other, especially against the backdrop of the first century society, even though there are tremendous overlaps in the qualities and attributes and orientations of both men and women. We can maybe take a quick look. The Focus on the Family, a Christian supporting organization that many of you are familiar with, lists some differences between the orientations of men and women. Now, these are just generalizations. They do not apply to each person out there, but they might be a bit illustrative for us. So the male orientation, they say, is often more outward. Every boy and every man is on a quest. He discovers his identity out there in the world where he senses his larger purpose and destiny lie. He takes great stock in knowing that he has what it takes to complete the quest and accomplish the task at hand. He's opportunistic. He's aggressive. He takes chances. He's competitive. Many of these things that you might nod your head and say, yeah, I can see that maybe in general guys are more that way, although certainly women have many of these characteristics just as much as many men do as well. And the female orientation is often more inward. Unlike the male who must go into the world to find his destiny, the woman possesses her future within herself. She has hidden but deep confidence in it. She may care more about being than doing, and finds the reason for being in relationship. She can value relationship, above all things, and seeks security and inward protection. And she's much more caring and will communicate using words, whereas men often will just communicate with information or ideas. She desires both equity and submission. A woman wants to be a man's equal, but an equal of a very special kind. At a deep and fundamental level, she has a strong desire to be led, protected, and cared for. And she wields a soft power. She has the ability to yield great and subtle influence in marriage and domestic relationships. Certainly, the extent to which gender differences are hardwired or cultural is an area of great discussion in society today. And we've had some of that discussion here in the church recently as we've talked about men's and women's roles in the church. But those who would maintain that there are no natural differences between men and women fly in the face of scriptural observation. Regardless, we can all benefit by the reminder that we are all to submit to one another as an example for how Jesus submitted to the cross on our behalf. Marilyn and I frequently joke about a line from the movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. In that very traditional setting, the husband may claim to be the head of the household, but the wife reminds her daughter that the wife is the neck that turns the head. As disciples, this influence should not be exercised with deceit, but transparently and as part of mutual submission. Point number 3 is for children, obey is not a 4-letter word. Well, actually, if you count the letters in it, there are 4, but it's not pejorative. It's not a bad word in the sense of being a 4-letter word. Colossians 3 verse 20 tells us that children should obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. And in Ephesians 6, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Since this is instruction directed to children, a safe assumption is that it applies to those old enough to hear or read it and obey it. Why are children instructed to obey and not to submit, do you think? I think that it might have to do with self-control. Submission is a voluntary exercise of self-control when you have the power to do elsewise. Obeying is just conforming your behavior to what is required, whether you want to or not. And learning to obey is a first step toward developing self-control. The Ephesian passage tells us that this act of obedience, whether the child wants to or not, whether they understand the reason behind it or not, honors their parents and thus honors God. We learn things both by deductive and by inductive reasoning, by learning to follow explicit rules and by absorbing the way things work by the environment that we're immersed in. Learning self-control when things are done with gentleness and love helps to prepare the child for the world where things will not always be done with such care. We see an example of the call to obedience for any of you who have served in the military. One of the big outcomes of sending soldiers to boot camp is helping young people to develop the self-control to obey their superiors regardless of the order. Learning to obey in a controlled training environment prepares one to function during the chaos and fog of war. I remember during my junior summer in college, when I went through the Army ROTC summer camp, which was the version of boot camp for those of us who would be graduating and becoming officers. Of course, we had a drill sergeant who was right out of central casting. He spent the summer yelling at us for everything, how tidy the barracks were or untidy they were, whether we were lining up late for formations, our incompetence in learning military skills, such as how to quickly assemble and disassemble our M16s. What we learned, though, was that even if we were wrongly being scolded for something, that you just had to keep your mouth shut and take it. On the battlefield, there's no time to complain or discuss or protest that it was the other guy or gal's turn to do the dirty work. For those of us who were going to become officers, we had to learn to take orders before we could be trusted to give orders. I remember attending airborne school when I first went on active duty, the Army's paratrooper training. And during one of the practice exercises on how to exit the aircraft, I missed one of the steps and a free cable was released on our practice tower at the wrong time. I can still acutely remember one of the training sergeants looking down from a tower and ordering me to drop in place and do 50 push-ups to make sure that I didn't make that mistake again when jumping out of real airplanes. The training was so rigorous that even though it's almost 40 years later, I can still recite the order of the commands for preparing and exiting the aircraft. Outboard personnel, stand up. Inboard personnel, stand up. Hook up. Check static lines. 2 minutes. 30 seconds. Stand in the door and hit it. Out the door you go. When things are really reinforced, you learn them well. And I think part of the call for our children to obey is for them to help to develop the self-control to be able to exercise submission to one another when they get older. Okay, point number 4, parents, your role is huge. Colossians 3:21, fathers, do not embitter your children or they will become discouraged. In this case, in the household, the children are to obey, at least those old enough to read the letter and understand it, so the parents can say, but if the children are obeying, the parents actually could say the old, you need to do it because I say so. Now, obviously, it's a lot better if they know why you're asking them to obey, but children should be able to. But otherwise, if parents do that too often, if you too often say, just do what I tell you to, you'll lose your child's heart and damage their faith. Other translations of this passage are, don't provoke lest they become discouraged. Don't exasperate so they won't lose heart. Don't aggravate or they'll become discouraged. Every child is different and parents need to really study what their child needs. Some will need more encouragement, some more boundaries. But this passage warns us that we can go too far with our instruction and discipline. Something that I started noticing about the time I graduated college is that in families of many of my friends, that the oldest child, especially if it was a son, would move away from home and typically move away from the town and state as soon as they could. The oldest seemed especially needing to really set off on their own and get away from their parents' household. My friend Jim Poland, whose brother was substantially older than he, observed that his parents had been much tougher on his brother, the firstborn, and had mellowed significantly by the time that Jim had come along. Since college, that older brother had always lived out of state. But since Jim made that observation, I've observed this as a typical pattern. This is not a universal biblical truth. I don't want you to think that. But I think it's often the case that parents and fathers in particular are much tougher on their firstborn, and seeing them move away is often part of the result. We know from the prodigal son that some of our children are wired to go and see what they can make of the world, but we want their memories of home to allow them to come back because they know that they will be accepted and treated well, just as the prodigal son knew that he too wouldn't be turned away. My mother used to say that it's a wonder that any of our first children grow up because they're the ones that we practice on. I'm afraid there's more truth in that than we would like, and the warning here is to be careful not to discourage our children. And then finally, point number 5, slaves, use your opportunity to honor Jesus. And masters too. Slaves, use your opportunity to honor your masters, and masters, use your opportunity to honor Jesus. Colossians 3:22. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Now, we don't have much time to address this giant issue of slaves and masters tonight. You probably know that slavery in the first century was not the same as the scourge of the race-based enslavement of American history. Many slaves in the first century were indentured servants who entered into this lifestyle because of economic need or debt. Others were captives during a war. Slaves or bond servants in the first century were not just manual laborers, although plenty were. They also ran whole households or businesses for their masters. Often they were the ones who taught the children of the family. We don't know why Jesus didn't just tell all Christian masters to release their slaves or all slaves to just revolt. There may have been practical as well as theological reasons, or it may have been just a recognition that by far the most important consideration was being a disciple of Jesus, and that everything else was almost inconsequential. In 1 Corinthians 7, we have an interesting verse where Paul is saying, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Evidently, some of the early Christians who were slaves felt like that pecking order from society carried over into the church. And, I'm not a high up, I'm just a slave. And so I'm really, really lowly in the church. Paul's, telling them to get rid of that. Don't let it trouble you, he says. But then he adds, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. So it's not saying you should remain a slave if you can get out of it, but if you can get out of it, do so. As a matter of fact, as Paul is sending this letter back to the Colossians, along with the letter, he's sending Onesimus, who was a slave, a servant of Philemon, and he's sending back a letter asking Philemon to free Onesimus. He doesn't do it himself, but he's asking Philemon to do it, which would then give Philemon, the honor, if you will, of being the one to free him. In Colossians, Paul is calling slaves and servants to obey into an attitude of wholehearted service as if serving Jesus himself, not just, when his eye is on him and then slouching off as soon as they could, but serving wholeheartedly. Regardless of whether our commitments are as binding as those of a slave, we can still adopt the same attitude in our jobs. Do you love your job? Serve like Jesus. Do you hate your job? Serve like Jesus. Do you feel mistreated in your job? Serve like Jesus. And this can be particularly hard. You're on your job 8 or more hours a day. It's not like just going into a situation. You might be, if you think of going to visit, maybe, your crazy Uncle Charlie that drives you a little bit nuts. You can paste a smile on your face and go spend an hour with him and everything's fine. But when you're in a workplace 8 hours a day, every day, all year long, who you really are and what your true attitude is comes out, and everyone knows it, and everyone sees that. Be a picture of Christ in the church in your workplace. Why? Because it's really Jesus that you're serving anyway, is what Paul is telling us here. How do you feel about coworkers who are always managing up? In other words, kissing up to the boss. Typically, that's not very endearing to fellow workers. Don't be like that. Others are always watching, and your impact can be very big. And many of you know Al Baird, although I expect we have a number here on the call tonight that don't. Al was an elder here in Boston for many years during the 80s and into the 90s before going on the church planting to Los Angeles. He and his wife, Gloria, had moved from Texas very early in their marriage to be part of a traditional Church of Christ planting to Burlington, Mass. Before going on ministry staff, Al had worked for many years as a physicist for the Sperry Rand Corporation. He was always very evangelistic, but had never converted anyone in his workplace until right near the end of his leaving to go into the ministry, when he was able to study the Bible with and baptize one of his coworkers. Someone asked this new disciple why he had responded to Al's outreach at this time when he had known Al for many years. He said they were allowed to use the office copy machine to make personal copies, as many of you may remember back in the day as we did that. but they were supposed to put a nickel in the cup that was left there to reimburse the company for it. He had noticed that Al, and Al alone, had always done that, always made sure to pay for his personal copies, and that no one else did. Al's example stood out like a shining beacon of righteousness. Al was serving Jesus through his conduct at work. I wish I could say the same for my example as an employee, but it's certainly not always been the case. And I wonder, especially during the pandemic, when many people have been working from home for the first time, how has your example been in giving a full day's effort to your boss while being at home and working, far away? Frankly, I've always maintained that I do much better working in an office than working from home because I get too easily distracted. But I want to hold up tonight my daughter, Rebecca, who's been working from home for this past year. And being at home, I have been just so impressed with her integrity for putting all of her hours in, setting an alarm when she goes on her lunch break so that she doesn't extend that and is back at her desk, when the time expires, and really showing terrific integrity, the kind that Jesus wants us to show in our workplace. I remember as a young disciple being so excited after I was baptized that I could go to heaven, that for a while I had an attitude that my job didn't matter. After all, it was going to pass away. It's all going to burn anyway. I'm going to heaven. And in fellowship, I remember sisters sharing this passage from Colossians with me and helping me see the importance of serving my job like serving Christ. Now, this passage on household codes ends with an admonition to masters. In that verse at the bottom of our slide here, chapter 4, verse 1, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you have a master in heaven. Just because you have a favored position in this life doesn't mean you will in the next. Masters are called to behave as those who know that they'll be judged. Several of Jesus's parables help us see that even more is expected of us if we've been given more than others. This includes our vocational position. So as we wind up, this section in Colossians that we've looked at tonight has a powerful message. Regardless of the position that we find ourselves in, wives, husbands, children, parents, slaves, masters, we all can show Jesus to the world, both his sacrificial love and the call for us to submit and trust him. The call to that is a challenge for each and every one of us. No one has it easy, but no one has an expectation beyond what God can pull them through either. If we follow this calling, then our households will be shining examples to the world. But tonight we're going to go ahead and break into groups in a random way. Kind of a question I have up here for discussion. For you, where do these household codes prick your conscience? How can you show Jesus to the world in whatever one of these settings and roles you want to list? And what is then one practical thing that you can do as a result to be more like Jesus in that situation, to show him to the world? So I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up here, turn it back over to Evan. I guess, Evan, you'll probably be the one to break us out into groups. And, Mark, I don't think we necessarily are coming back together afterwards for announcements, are we? We'll just end with the groups. Okay. And I believe this Sunday we have our service Cash McCard will be preaching to us. And then next Wednesday night, we will be meeting again for our last SEC class. There's not a break in between them this time. So make sure to be set for class on Wednesday night again. So turn it back over to you. Thank you very much.